On the 25th of October, Sudan's General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan imposed a nationwide state of emergency across the country and dissolved Abdallah Hamdoks' transitional government and the top ruling body, the Sovereign Council, a joint military-civilian power-sharing authority.
First of all, we are declaring a state of emergency. Second, we are dissolving the Sovereign Council and removing the state governors. We remain committed to the international agreements signed during the rule of the interim government.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Kenya and a warm welcome to Africa Today, a program that gives you an alternative view of events making headlines in Africa. Now, this week's edition is focusing on the ongoing political crisis in Sudan after the country's military seized power after dissolving a fragile transitional government. Sudan's people have taken to the streets to condemn the coup.
اعتقلوا الوزراء، اعتقلوا ناس من مجلس السيادة. ده انقلاب تامي حرفيا واحنا بنرفضه تماما. ترجع للوثيقة الدستورية وتراجعها وتسلم الحكومة للمدنيين وترجع للوثيقة الدستورية وتفك الناس اللي حبستهم ديل وترجعهم لمناصبهم ويستغيل البرهان. المطلب الأساسي بقى في الشارع استغالة البرهان.
In our show today, we are asking, what is the real reason behind the coup, and are foreign powers such as the US and the Israeli regime involved in fomenting Sudan's political turmoil? Stay with us until the end of the show for the answers.
Sudan in political turmoil. On the 25th of October, the Sudanese military, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, took control of the transitional government in a military coup. Al-Burhan dissolved the military-civilian Sovereign Council that had been established to guide the country to democracy after the overthrow of long-ruling autocrat Omar al-Bashir in a popular uprising 2 years ago. In essence, he staged a palace coup against the government of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdoks and the transitional authority he chaired. Some observers believe that the dispute between the civilian and military leaders in Sudan was exploited to divert the main demands of the Sudanese people.
Following the military takeover, Sudan's main opposition coalition called for civil disobedience and protests across the country. Clashes have rocked Khartoum as Sudan's security forces continue with a crackdown on furious anti-coup protesters. One of the protesters speaks here on the people's resolve to fight for a fully fledged civilian government.
البيان بكل ما يحتوي مرفوض تماما. مطلوب حكومة مدنية. حل المجلس العسكري. ما في أي تفاوض مع العساكر حتى بعد تسقط تاني إن شاء الله بإذن واحد الأحد. الشعب عنيد والشعب صابر والشعب مصندد على إنه الحكومة لازم ترجع مدنية.
Now, to discuss the unfolding situation in Sudan, my colleague contacted Dr. Nisreen El-Amin, a researcher on foreign land grabs and the militarization of borders in East Africa and the Sahel. We also have Adil Abdel-Ati, a Sudanese politician, media activist, and the chairman of the Sudan of the Future political bloc. Now, Dr. El-Amin started by elaborating on what she believes is the real reason behind the military takeover in Sudan.
To answer your question, I would say that there are two reasons that behind this military takeover. One is that al-Burhan, who is the de facto head of state at the moment, was and the head of the Sovereignty Council, which was made up of civilians and military members, was scheduled to hand over power over, it was essentially scheduled to hand over power to a civilian member of the Sovereignty Council, and he was unwilling to give up that power in part because of a fear of being indicted for war crimes that he's responsible for in Darfur, but also during the civil war in South Sudan. The other reason is that there have been conversations within the transitional government that have also led to some of these tensions that I mentioned earlier, because much of the economy is still under the control of military members of the former regime, including al-Burhan. So currently 250 companies in the areas of gold mining, for example, flour, sesame, other kind of industries, if you will, are under the control of members of the military. And Hamdok was very much pushing for those companies to be transferred to the government. And so he, al-Burhan and his deputy Hamidti stand to lose from that kind of transfer.
The actions taken by Sudan's military have many parallels with Egypt's tumultuous summer of 2013. Prime Minister Hamdok and his cabinet ostensibly had responsibility for the day-to-day management of the government. However, their efforts were often been handcuffed by the structure of the transitional government, which favored the military.
Now, our question is, did the civilian leadership place too much trust in the military without learning from other countries, especially neighboring Egypt?
They have succeeded to eliminate all political forces which demanded the giving power to the civilians and a short transitional period. And after 2 months of negotiation, at the beginning, they planned the massacre of the protesters in the sit-in in Khartoum, where hundreds of people were killed at dawn. So that was a way to force other political parties to accept their role in the transitional government. And unfortunately, some of the political parties, they agreed to this and they became partners to them. They succeeded also to arrange the transitional government to be for 3 years, and after that they prolonged this to 4 years.
Well, the coup came hours after U.S. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, held talks with Sudanese military leaders. And this has raised speculation that Washington was aware or actually supported the military takeover. Of course, the U.S. has publicly condemned the coup in Sudan, but this is seen as just a public relations gimmick. Dr. Nisreen gives her take here on the possible role by the United States in the power grab by Sudan's military.
In October, for example, of 2020, Sudan was removed from the state sponsors list, list of state sponsors of terrorism, and that removal was tied to Sudan being asked to normalize relations with Israel. And that was kind of under the auspices of the United States to position Sudan as kind of to open it up for foreign investment and to allow Sudan to kind of get in the good graces of the international financial institutions and to be able to take out loans and to have its debt, most of its debt really forgiven. And so that's kind of where the U.S. has been a relatively new player, if you will, because Sudan has been isolated for so long, having been on that list. And so, Feldman met with al-Burhan a few hours before this coup happened or began, and says that he's surprised that it happened. At the same time, al-Burhan had just visited Sisi in Egypt, and it appears that he kind of got the green light to do what he's done. And so what appears to me is that you have U.S. allies in the region like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Civilian leaders in Sudan had expressed reservations about the country's normalization with the Israeli regime. For instance, Foreign Minister of the ousted Sudanese Transitional Authority, Maryam al-Sadiq al-Mahdi, downplayed normalization of ties with the Israeli regime. Protesters across Sudan also held demonstrations rejecting the move by the Transitional Authority to normalize ties with the Israeli regime, insisting that they will always stand with Palestine.
Most Sudanese oppose the normalization of ties with the Israeli regime, as this Khartoum resident explains.
ضد التطبيع، لأنه التطبيع لا يخدم مصلحة للسودان لا الآن ولا غدا. أنا بلدي دي بناسي بالسودانيين بالناس اللي فيها ممكن يخدموا ونبقى أحسن من إسرائيل ونبقى أحسن من أمريكا ونبقى أحسن من الناس كلها لو تكاتفنا وخطينا يدنا مع بعض.
Well, Mr. Adil believes that the recent coup was most likely instigated by the Israeli regime to pave way for complete normalization.
Israeli factor is very important in this coup. We don't know about direct involvement of Israel in organizing the coup, but they could inspire it, or they could promise the military leaders some kind of support. We know that there were visits from Mossad to Sudan and secret meetings with al-Burhan and with Hemeti in Sudan and in other countries. We know that there were some kind of intelligence support from Israel to the junta in Sudan. We know that the military leaders, al-Burhan himself and also Hemeti, were very eager to normalize the situation with Israel and to build diplomatic relations.
While announcing the military takeover, al-Burhan said the military will appoint a technocrat government to lead the country to elections set for July 2023. But he made clear the military will remain in charge in what is seen as following the same script that was used when the military grabbed power in neighboring Egypt.
We're stressing here that the armed forces intend to complete the democratic transition until the country's leadership is handed over to an elected civilian government who can bring these issues to life.
What is the game plan of the military rulers? Can we expect Sudan to move to a military rule similar to the one in Egypt?
The people on the streets have a very clear message that they will not be governed by any government that is formed by al-Burhan and the military remnants of the al-Bashir regime. And I don't think they're going to be leaving the streets until their demands are met. And so, to me, the comparisons with Egypt are not ones I would like to make. I'm hopeful and very proud of the people who are risking their lives on the street, who are defending this revolution. And I do think that al-Burhan and his sort of, and his crew, if you will, that their days are numbered.
Several people have been killed after security forces clashed with protesters furious over the military coup. An opposition activist speaks here during the funeral of one of the slain protesters.
الفريد الشهيد محمد عبد السلام ميدو قتل في يوم الانقلاب المشؤوم في كوبري كوبر. كنا عدد من سوار السائرات في كوبري كوبر، تم اقتناصه بواسطة عسكر البرهان. نحن ما حنتهم عساكر مسيطرين، احنا بنتهم البرهان شخصيا انه قتل ولدنا، انه قاعد يزعزع في امن السودانيين في هذه الايام.
Well, we shall now take a short break, and when we come back, we shall talk about how the United Nations and the African Union reacted to the coup in Sudan. So stay with us.
Sudan in political turmoil.
The military coup in Sudan has attracted widespread condemnation internationally. The United Nations has led calls for restoration of civilian rule in the country.
The Secretary General strongly condemns the ongoing military coup d'etat in Khartoum and all actions that could jeopardize Sudan's political transition and stability. The Secretary General calls for the immediate reconstitution of the governing arrangements provided under the constitutional document. Sudanese stakeholders must immediately return to dialogue and engage in good faith to restore the constitutional order and Sudan's transitional process. The United Nations reiterates its unwavering commitment and support to the realization of Sudan's political transition. Any attempt to undermine the transition process puts at risk Sudan's security, stability, and development.
The African Union has said it suspended Sudan from all its activities after the country's military overthrew the civilian-led transitional government. The continent-wide bloc said it strongly condemns the seizure of power and was suspending Sudan from all AU activities until the effective restoration of the civilian-led transitional authority. This move by the African Union was similar to other measures in the wake of military coups in the continent.
Mr. Adel believes that failure by the African Union to take tangible action against coup leaders will affect the credibility of this Pan-African organization.
The African Union failed the African people in preventing military leaders from gaining power and in dealing with coups like in Mali, like in Guinea, and in other countries now in Sudan. As the position of the African Union is very, very weak. That is because the African Union almost consisted of different countries which are ruled by military leaders. And it is an organization of official countries and official government. So this is that is the reason why their positions are very weak. The Sudanese people are not looking anymore for the African Union to defend them. Rather, they are relying on themselves and on some limited international support.
The Transitional Authority, led by General Burhan, had pledged to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, which has issued arrest warrants for Bashir for alleged war crimes in the restive Darfur region. However, the pursuit of justice over Darfur was a point of tension between the military and civilian leaders.
The military has always appeared reluctant in taking action on the thorny issue of handing Bashir over to the ICC to be charged with crimes against humanity. The question many are asking is, will this file be closed after the coup?
I think in many ways, as I said earlier, al-Burhan has been resistant to hand over power to a civilian member of the Sovereignty Council, in part because he fears being indicted for similar war crimes, right, that al-Bashir has been indicted for by the ICC. And so, you know, in some ways, I think it might be, we might have to sort of think about that file is closed, but it's also unclear. I mean, they've thrown al-Bashir under the bus before, so.
In late 2019, a Sudanese court convicted former President Omar al-Bashir on corruption charges and sentenced him to 2 years of detention in a reform facility. Many analysts, including Adel, believe the sentence was lenient due to the influence of Bashir within the military.
Bashir is the mentor of these generals. He was their commander-in-chief for 30 years, and they are very connected to him. Also, they are afraid that Bashir will become a witness against them if he's handed to the international criminal law, and he will bring them by witnessing also against them as partners in the crimes. So they will never give him, and they will never give him even a good trial in Sudan for his crimes against humanity, for genocide and for war crimes.
General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and other Sudanese military leaders have close ties to Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It's clearly not in the interest of these countries to see a democratic Sudan.
The U.S. is trying to distort and misdirect the popular revolutionary movement in Sudan to prevent similar movements from gaining popularity in Arab regimes allied to Washington. So what role, if any, did regional powers such as Egypt, the UAE and Saudi Arabia play in the current military takeover in Sudan?
I mean, they're probably the more major players. And I think one of the things to remember is that al-Burhan, he was trained in a military college in Egypt, has strong ties to Sisi, and was always seen as, he also actually played an important role in supporting the Saudi coalition to fight in the war in Yemen. And so I think at that time we saw al-Burhan and others emerge as kind of more loyal allies to the Saudi, UAE, Egypt kind of coalition. And they actually pledged, as soon as al-Bashir was ousted, the Saudi Arabia and the UAE immediately pledged about $2 billion in aid to support the Transitional Military Council before the partnership and the transitional government was formed. So right there you see that they've always been very supportive of the military elements of this government.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up for today. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Nisreen El-Amin, a researcher on foreign land grabs and militarization of borders in East Africa and the Sahel, and also Adil Abdel Ati, a Sudanese politician and chairman of the Sudan of the Future political bloc. Here at Africa Today, we shall continue giving you an alternative view of events taking place in Africa. And that's it for this week's edition of Africa Today. Drop us a line through our social media handle and let us know your views. You can also watch today's episode by visiting our website, presstv.ir. From me, Mubarak Kenya, it's goodbye for now.